In the summer of 1874, in the deep fields of rural Alabama, there was a house that did not exist. Not on maps, not in tax records, not in church logs, and most disturbingly, not in the Plantation Census. Every soul in Wilkes County had been counted that year. Every landowner, every laborer, every child old enough to breathe. The Freedmen's Bureau agents had gone door to door, documenting a South trying to stitch itself back together after war. But there was one structure standing 3 miles beyond the cotton rows of the Ashford plantation that no census taker ever recorded. And the people who lived inside it were never written down. Not once. What makes this story unbearable is not that a family went missing. It is that they were never officially there. The land they occupied technically belonged to the Plantation Church, a modest wooden chapel built in 1858 by Reverend Elijah Dorrance. After the Civil War, the church remained active, even as the plantation economy collapsed. Records show baptisms, marriages, funerals, everything accounted for. Except one family, a mother, a father, 4 children, seen by neighbors, heard by field hands, described in letters, but absent from every government document, as if the earth itself had swallowed their names. And when we examine the fragments left behind, the letters, the church minutes, the private journal of a schoolteacher, something even darker begins to surface. This was not an oversight. This was deliberate. Someone erased them. And in 1874 Alabama, erasure required cooperation. Ashford Plantation sat on 2,000 acres of heavy soil and inherited guilt. Before the war, it had been prosperous. After emancipation, it became something else, a struggling estate clinging to control through religious authority rather than chains. Reverend Dorrance was more than a pastor. He was the moral architect of the community. In Reconstruction, Alabama, churches became power centers. They recorded births. They witnessed contracts. They shaped memory. If something wasn't written in the church ledger, it effectively never happened. In 1873, a new structure was added behind the chapel, officially labeled as a charitable dwelling for displaced persons. No official occupants were listed. Yet within months, local testimonies mention a family living there. A teacher named Clara Whitmore wrote in her diary, "The children by the woods do not attend services. They watch from behind the sycamores. Their mother never speaks. The father does not remove his hat. She never wrote their surname. No one did." Field workers described seeing smoke rising from the cottage before dawn. They spoke of him like murmurs at night, not church hymns, but something older, rhythm without melody. But when federal agents returned in early 1874 to verify population counts, Reverend Dorrance personally escorted them around the property. The charitable dwelling was described as unoccupied and in disrepair. Yet multiple townspeople later insisted they had seen light in the windows the very night before. So who was lying? Or perhaps more terrifying, who was being hidden? By autumn of 1874, rumors changed shape. At first, it was about absence from census records. Then it became something else. The children. Witness accounts begin to contradict each other in disturbing ways. Some claimed there were 4 children. Others insisted there were 5. A farmhand swore under oath decades later that he saw only 3, but always the same 3. The most chilling detail? They never seemed to grow. Clara Whitmore's diary spans 3 years. Across dozens of entries, she describes seeing the smallest boy by the tree line or the eldest girl carrying water. Her descriptions never change. Same height, same pale clothing, same expressionless stare. Children in 19th century Alabama grew quickly. Hard labor and poor diet did not pause development. But these children appeared fixed in time. One entry dated March 1875 reads, "I am certain now that the boy has not grown an inch. His face is neither sickly nor healthy. It is simply still. Still. Not frozen. Still. As if waiting." Church attendance records show that Reverend Dorrance preached increasingly about uncounted souls and the danger of inviting the nameless in his sacred ground. The sermons were cryptic, almost defensive. But defensive against what? There are no medical reports of illness in the dwelling. No death certificates. No burial markers. It is as though the family existed in a narrow band of visibility, seen just enough to frighten, but never enough to be verified. And when the winter of 1875 arrived, something shifted. The smoke from the cottage stopped, but no one ever reported them leaving. January 14, 1876. The Ashford Chapel burned to the ground. Official cause: faulty lantern left near dry hymnals. Unofficial whispers: judgment. The fire spread unnaturally fast, according to the only surviving witness statement. A farm overseer who claimed the flames seemed to begin beneath the floorboards, not above them. The charitable dwelling behind the chapel was untouched, completely untouched, even though it stood close enough that sparks should have consumed it. After the fire, Reverend Dorrance relocated services to a nearby town. Within months, he left Alabama entirely. The land was sold in parcels. The cottage was dismantled, and yet, there remains no purchase record for its lumber. No receipt. No reconstruction site. It vanished materially, just as its occupants had vanished bureaucratically. Clara Whitmore stopped writing in her diary 2 weeks after the fire. Her final entry: they were never meant to be counted. We were. What does that mean? Who was we? And why did every remaining resident of Wilkes County refuse, in later interviews, to speak the word family in relation to the dwelling? Instead, they used a different word: presence. A presence by the woods. Not people. Not neighbors. A presence. And in Reconstruction, Alabama, language was everything. To rename something was to control it, or to fear it. In 1932, during a courthouse renovation, a box of church documents from Ashford Plantation was discovered in the attic of a county clerk's home. Inside were baptism records, marriage licenses, donation lists, and a ledger. The pages from January 1874 through February 1876 had been carefully cut out. Not torn. Cut. With precision. But the indentation from ink remained faintly visible on the following pages. When examined under angled light decades later, faint impressions could be traced. Repeated phrases. House beyond count. Under pastoral care only. Not to be entered into civil record. Who would write such instructions? And why? The church was the only institution with both authority and motive to remove a family from public record. But here is the most unsettling discovery. The ledger's final intact page contains a list of offerings collected for maintenance of the dwelling. Names of donors. Nearly every prominent family in Wilkes County. They all contributed. They all knew. Which suggests something even darker than concealment. It suggests agreement. The family in the cottage was not hidden accidentally. They were protected, or contained. And sometimes, the difference between those two words is the difference between mercy and imprisonment. By 1876, the official story was simple. The chapel burned, the land was sold, and Ashford Plantation faded into the long list of Southern estates swallowed by time. But the private letters tell a different story. In the estate papers of former plantation owner Thomas Ashford, discovered in 1911, there is a folded memorandum signed by Reverend Elijah Dorrance. It is not a sermon. It is not scripture. It is a warning. The document refers to something called the doctrine of containment. The language is chillingly bureaucratic. The household beyond enumeration must remain under spiritual governance. Civil recognition risks contagion, not of flesh, but of inheritance. Contagion of inheritance. That phrase appears 3 times. Not disease. Not rebellion. Inheritance. To understand this, we need context. Reconstruction Alabama was built on unstable ground. Property rights were shifting. Newly freed families were claiming land. Courts were overwhelmed with disputes over titles and lineage. If a person could prove bloodline, they could claim ownership. And if a family existed outside all records, they could not. Or perhaps, they could claim everything. Some historians speculate that Ashford Plantation was sitting on disputed land prior to the war. There were whispers that part of the acreage had been seized decades earlier from a small homestead, whose original owners vanished without legal transfer. No deed. No death certificate. No proof of extinction. If descendants of that original homestead still lived, and could prove lineage, the entire plantation could legally revert. But how do you prevent a legal claim? You erase the claimants. Not by killing them. By uncounting them. The doctrine of containment was not spiritual paranoia. It was legal strategy disguised as theology, and the church was its instrument. In 1948, a University of Alabama archivist named Harold Meeks stumbled upon an anomaly while cataloging Reconstruction-era documents. He found a midwife's notebook from Wilkes County dated 1869 to 1875. Midwives were meticulous record keepers. Births meant payment, and payment meant documentation. On one page, under the year 1870, 5 entries appear without surnames. Each entry lists only child of the woods, no mother named, no father listed, no location specified, 5 births between 1870 and 1874, each marked with a small cross beside the name, not to signify death, but completion, as if something had been fulfilled. Meeks attempted to trace the midwife's descendants. The family refused interviews. One grandson reportedly said, "That notebook should have been burned." Why? Because those 5 entries align almost perfectly with the rumored ages of the children seen near the cottage. But here is what makes the record unbearable. The handwriting changes halfway through the 5th entry. The ink darkens. The script becomes strained. And beneath the final line, pressed so hard the page nearly tears, are 3 words. Do not count them. The phrase mirrors the church ledger. Separate documents. Different hands. Same instruction. This was not superstition. This was coordination. In February 1875, 1 year before the chapel fire, something happened at the Wilkes County Schoolhouse. It was never officially reported, but 3 personal accounts survive. According to Clara Whitmore's diary, a storm forced several children to remain after class. Among them was the eldest girl from the woods. This is the only time one of the unnamed children entered a public building. Clara describes her as silent, with eyes like someone listening to something far away. When the storm worsened, Clara offered to walk the girl home. The girl refused. She reportedly said, "My father says the lines keep us safe." Lines. Clara later wrote that when she turned to retrieve her coat, every other child had left the room. She and the girl were alone. And then, in her own words, "The air grew heavy, as though numbers themselves were pressing against my skull." Numbers. Clara fainted. When she awoke, the room was empty. The storm had passed. There were no footprints in the mud outside the schoolhouse door, and the girl never returned. After that day, Clara's diary tone shifts from curiosity to dread. She begins referencing matters of counting and boundaries not meant to be crossed. 3 months later, she stopped teaching. 2 months after that, the church burned. Section 9. The Census Taker's Confession. In 1891, a retired census enumerator named Samuel Griggs wrote a letter to his brother that was never mailed. It was found decades later among family belongings. Griggs had been part of the 1874 verification team that visited Ashford Plantation. His letter reads like a confession. He admits that during the property inspection, he saw movement in the cottage window. He describes a small hand against the glass. When he asked Reverend Dorrance about the dwelling, the Reverend reportedly said, "There are some souls better left outside the arithmetic of men." Griggs writes that he felt a sudden nausea, not fear, but something closer to vertigo. He says that when he attempted to mark the structure on his survey sheet, the ink would not hold. 3 times he wrote the word occupied. 3 times the ink bled into illegibility. He ultimately left the space blank. His final sentence, "I do not know whether I failed my duty or obeyed something older than it." The letter was dated October 3, 1891. Griggs died 2 weeks later. Cause listed as natural, but his family claimed he had been speaking of lines in the dirt before his death. Lines. Again, in 1972, a graduate student conducting a land survey overlay study made a disturbing discovery. When comparing pre-war property maps with modern satellite imagery, she noticed faint geometric markings beneath the original Ashford boundary lines. The shapes did not align with agricultural divisions. They formed something else, a perimeter. The charitable dwelling had been positioned precisely at the center of that perimeter, as if placed intentionally. Older maps, dating back to 1821, show a small homestead on that exact spot, long before Ashford Plantation expanded. The homestead disappears from records in 1833. No fire recorded, no sale documented, no burial registry, just absence. If that original family had descendants, and if those descendants were the household beyond enumeration, then containment was not about protection. It was about preventing reclamation. But here is the question that refuses to leave. If the church, the plantation owners, the census takers, and the midwife all agreed to erase this family, what were they so afraid would happen if the family was counted? Because you do not coordinate silence across decades unless the truth threatens something larger than reputation. It threatens structure. And in 1874 Alabama, structure was everything. In the spring of 1876, just weeks before the chapel burned, a traveling carpenter named Isaiah Bell passed through Wilkes County looking for work. He left behind a pocket notebook. Most of it is simple: measurements, lumber costs, repair jobs. But one entry stands alone. He writes that Reverend Dorrance hired him to inspect the cottage behind the chapel. Bell describes something strange before he even reached the door. There was a shallow trench carved into the earth around the property. Not a fence, not a hedge, just a thin, unbroken line in the soil. He stepped across it without thinking. He wrote, "Felt a pressure in my ears as though I had descended under water." Inside, he claimed the house was warm despite no visible fire. The family was present: father seated at the table, mother near the hearth, children lined along the far wall. But Bell notes something that chilled him. There are no personal objects, no toys, no keepsakes, no photographs, only chairs and a table, as if placed for demonstration. When he attempted to measure a warped beam near the ceiling, the father stood and calmly said, "You should remain on your side of the count." Bell did not understand the phrase. He finished quickly and left. That night, he dreamed of walking through rows of graves without names, each stone blank. The next morning, he returned to retrieve a tool he had forgotten. The trench was gone. The cottage door stood open. Inside, no furniture remained. No dust impressions. No footprints. Just bare floorboards. 3 days later, the church burned. After the fire, Reverend Dorrance relocated to Mississippi. His sermons from that period survive in fragment. They shift from scripture to numbers. He begins speaking of false enumerations and the arrogance of men who attempt to total what belongs to God. One line appears repeatedly: "There are households born before record, and to record them is to undo what was mercifully concealed." Mercifully concealed. Was the family hidden for their protection, or to protect everyone else? In one sermon transcript, Dorrance refers to a forgotten massacre in 1833, the year the original homestead vanished from maps. There are no official records of such an event in Wilkes County, but oral histories collected in the 1930s speak of a dispute between Ashford's father and a small landholding family who refused to sell. Some claim the conflict turned violent. Others say the family simply left in the night. But land rarely forgets blood. If descendants survived, if they remained quietly in that cottage decades later, then counting them would reopen claims older than the plantation itself. And not just legal claims, moral ones. The arithmetic of sin does not disappear with paperwork. It accumulates. And if the children truly did not age, if witnesses were not exaggerating, perhaps they represented something else entirely. Not ghosts, not spirits, but consequence. A family anchored to land that refused to release them. In 1889, 12 years after the fire, a small church-run orphanage opened 2 counties away. Its founder? A former deacon from Ashford Chapel. The orphanage ledger contains a peculiar rule: no child without surname shall be entered. Why specify that? Because in rural Alabama, many orphaned children lacked formal surnames. Yet this institution required one. Several children were reportedly turned away for that reason. Among them, according to a local newspaper clipping, were for siblings claiming Woodland residence. No surnames given. The article states they disappeared before authorities could question them. For siblings. The number again. Witnesses described them as well-spoken but distant. The youngest boy reportedly asked the orphanage matron, "Will you count us properly?" The matron later told a friend she felt as though the room tilted when he said it. That same orphanage burned down in 1893. Cause listed as kitchen fire. No fatalities. But the building collapsed inward, almost neatly, as though folded. No further records of the Woodland siblings exist after that year. Clara Whitmore resurfaced once, in 1902, when she mailed a letter to a former colleague. The letter was never sent. It was found among her possessions after her death in 1904. In it, she writes, "I have come to believe that counting is not merely a civil act, but a spiritual trespass. We mark what we think we understand. We total what we believe we own." She claims that on the night before the church fire, she saw the children standing in a line beyond the trench. Not inside it. Outside, facing the chapel. She writes that the eldest girl spoke. "We were counted once." Clara asks in the letter, "Counted by whom?" And then, in handwriting that grows unsteady, if they were erased. then something else must remember them. And if something remembers, it may also balance. Balance. The word appears twice. Clara died without descendants. Her diary remained sealed in a trunk for decades. No mention of the family appears in her official obituary, as if even memory complied. Section 15. The Surveyor's Discovery. In 1986, during a highway expansion project, construction crews uncovered foundation stones near the old Ashford land. The stones formed a square matching the dimensions of the charitable dwelling. But beneath that foundation, they found something older. Charred beams. And beneath those beams, gravestones. 5 of them. Blank. No names. No dates. Just smooth stone. Archaeologists determined the graves predated the plantation by at least 20 years, meaning the original homestead family likely never left. They were buried. Without record. Without acknowledgement. If their descendants later lived in that cottage, on top of unmarked graves, then the church's doctrine of containment becomes something far darker. It was not hiding the living. It was suppressing proof of the dead. And if the children did not age, perhaps they were never meant to. When the 5 blank gravestones were uncovered in 1986, local officials moved quickly. Too quickly. Within 48 hours, the site was declared historically insignificant. The stones were removed under the label of routine relocation. No press release. No public records request allowed without formal petition. But one junior archaeologist, Daniel Hargrove, kept photographs. In a 1994 interview recorded shortly before his death, Hargrove described the stones in detail. They weren't worn down by weather, he said. They were made blank. That distinction matters. Weather erases. Blankness is intentional. He also mentioned something else. Each stone had a faint groove carved across its base, a shallow horizontal line. Not decorative, not structural. A line. The same line Isaiah Bell described carved into the dirt around the cottage in 1876. The same word the unnamed girl spoke to Clara Whitmore. Lines keep us safe. Safe from what? Or safe for whom? Hargrove claimed that when one of the stones was lifted, workers felt a sudden drop in temperature, despite the Alabama heat. No bodies were exhumed for examination. The graves were transferred quietly to an unmarked municipal lot. No ceremony. No religious rites. Just relocation. Erasure, once again. But Hargrove ended his interview with a sentence that has never left those who heard it. They weren't hiding the graves from the public. They were hiding the public from the graves. Look at the timeline. 1833, the original homestead disappears. 1876, the chapel burns. 1893, the orphanage collapses in fire. Each time, institutions connected to record-keeping and guardianship go up in flames. Each time, documents are lost. Each time, names vanish. Fire, in the South, was both destruction and purification. But these fires seem surgical, targeted, never spreading beyond their intended structures. Almost as if something corrected the balance whenever containment weakened. If the church burned after the children entered public space. If the orphanage fell after turning away unnamed siblings. If the gravestones resurfaced only to be buried again. Then the pattern is not random. It is reactive. Reconstruction-era America obsessed over counting. Counting freedmen, counting land, counting losses. Numbers were power. But what if something resisted enumeration? What if the act of counting a wronged bloodline reactivated a claim older than law? The doctrine of containment begins to sound less like superstition and more like damage control. Because if the original Homestead family was killed in 1833, buried without record, and if their descendants remained physically present decades later, then every census that ignored them was an act of protection. Not for them, for everyone else. The final credible sighting of the family comes from 1901. A railway worker named Thomas Greer reported seeing four pale figures standing near the tree line bordering the former Ashford property. He described them as dressed in outdated clothing, mid-1870s style, unmoved by passing trains. Unchanged. He wrote in a personal letter. They did not wave. They did not step back. They watched the cars as though counting. Counting. Greer's supervisor dismissed the claim. But Greer insisted on one detail. They were the same height as the children I saw 25 years ago. Same height. No aging. No alteration. If true, then the family did not simply vanish after the chapel fire. They remained. Outside official record. Outside time. After 1901, no more sightings appear in writing. But oral histories from Wilkes County, recorded in the 1930s, include references to the quiet ones by the woods. Older residents would lower their voices when speaking of them. One elderly man reportedly said, "They're waiting for someone to count wrong." Count wrong. Meaning what? Overlook them again. Or finally include them. Because perhaps containment only worked as long as the silence remained unanimous. What happens to a town that participates in collective forgetting? Generations pass, but guilt lingers. Wilkes County experienced unusually high rates of institutional fires between 1870 and 1910. Courthouse annexes, schoolhouses, storage barns holding archived deeds. Most were ruled accidental, but the frequency is striking. Records fade, paper burns, memory thins, and yet, beneath that thinning surface, something heavy remains. Modern psychologists studying historical trauma speak of inherited anxiety, communities carrying stress from unresolved wrongdoing. If a massacre occurred in 1833, if a church protected its legacy through concealment, if census takers complied out of fear or pressure, then the psychological burden would not disappear. It would settle into land, into stories, into the spaces between official lines on paper. Perhaps the family was never supernatural. Perhaps they were flesh and blood descendants of injustice, forced into invisibility for the sake of property and power. But invisibility is not absence, and uncounted does not mean unreal. Today, nothing stands where Ashford Plantation once stretched across cotton fields. The highway runs over part of it. A convenience store sits near the old boundary line. Cars pass without knowing what lies beneath. 5 blank graves relocated to a municipal corner. A ledger with missing pages. A midwife's warning carved into paper. Do not count them. But here is the truth that refuses burial. Every census since 1874 has attempted to total every life in Wilkes County. Yet the original Homestead family, if descendants truly remained, were never formally acknowledged. No restitution filed. No land reclaimed. No official correction. And if justice requires recognition, then the arithmetic is unfinished. Perhaps the children did not age because they were not meant to grow inside erasure. Perhaps they were a living reminder, not haunting, not vengeful, but patient, waiting for acknowledgement, waiting for someone brave enough to break the old agreement, to write the names that were cut from the ledger, to speak the surname that was never recorded. Because silence is a contract, and contracts can expire. The question is not whether the family existed. The evidence suggests they did. The question is this: what? In 2003, a local radio station in southern Alabama aired a short segment about forgotten Reconstruction stories. One caller claimed her great-grandmother had spoken about the house that could not be written. The station archived the recording, but within a week, it was removed from public access. A copy survives in private hands. In it, the caller, who never gives her full name, says this: "The most disturbing part of this story is not the missing census entry. It is the cooperation. Midwife, pastor, landowner, enumerator, deacon, all participating, not loudly, not violently, but through silence. Why? Because admitting the truth would have unraveled inheritance. Land titles would be questioned, wealth redistributed, reputations destroyed. Institutions protect themselves first. Churches protect doctrine. Plantations protected property. Governments protected records. And so a family was pushed into the margins. But margins are not voids. They are edges. And edges are sharp. For over a century, Wilkes County experienced small disruptions, fires, document losses, economic instability. Nothing dramatic enough to spark national attention. Just enough to feel unsettled. As if the land itself resisted complete ownership. Perhaps that is what Clara Whitmore meant by balance. Not revenge. Not haunting. Balance. If you visit the former Ashford property now, you will not find ruins. You will find trees. Thick, patient trees. Locals still avoid a small patch near where the cottage once stood. Not because they believe in ghosts, but because, as one resident quietly admitted in 1998, it doesn't feel like ours. That phrase echoes through generations. Doesn't feel like ours. Ownership on paper does not guarantee ownership in truth. The 5 blank gravestones still sit in a municipal lot, marked only with numbered stakes. No names have been added. No formal acknowledgement issued. The county denies any verified massacre in 1833, but denial is not proof, and blank stone is not innocence. If the family truly waited at the edge of record, if they lingered in memory, in sightings, in unfinished arithmetic, then perhaps they were never meant to frighten. Perhaps they were meant to remind that what is erased does not dissolve. It accumulates. So here we are, 150 years later, looking back at a space in a census ledger where a house should have been marked occupied. A blank, a deliberate blank. History often teaches us about what happened, but sometimes the most powerful stories are about what was prevented from happening. A name spoken, a claim filed, a truth acknowledged. If the family beyond enumeration truly existed, and the fragments suggest they did, then their power was not in curse or myth. It was in legitimacy, and legitimacy is dangerous to institutions built on stolen ground. The children who did not age may simply symbolize what injustice does when it is never confronted. It waits. It remains unchanged. It stands at the edge of the woods, not fading, not advancing, until someone decides to look directly at it, to count honestly, to write the name that was cut from the page. Because history does not end when the fire dies. It ends when the ledger is corrected. And maybe, somewhere beneath Alabama soil, 5 blank stones are still waiting for someone brave enough to finish the arithmetic. Uncounted, but never erased.